Much. Thanks also for the invitation to this conference, which I think is a very good contribution to the current debate on freedom and security, which we are having in very several shadows in very several areas of our lives, but in particular with regard to, of course, digitization and new technologies and networks. I think that freedom and security, so freedom and safety also, are two sides of the same medal. It's both connected, it's both also dependent on each other. So it's impossible to just put a contradiction between both without looking at the issue of so many interactions of both elements. So therefore, I think that the most important very often in this debate is to make sure that we're talking about what are the conditions for both values and what do we need to have as reconciliation between certain interests which might be in contradiction to each other when looking at both aims. And that is in particular when we look at information systems today, standards for security of systems. I think there it's very visible that it is contributing to both interests, preserving freedoms and civil liberties, privacy, and on the other side also preserving a secure environment, safety, and also security interests. Although, of course, very often today, some aims of security authorities, of those dealing with security, are more to lower safety standards and to lower security standards in order to do their work more easy. And that is a debate which we're having today, for example, when it comes to techniques, security techniques like encryption or other safeguards which may be implemented in information systems, and where, for example, investigators say that they are hampered to gather information relevant for their work to chase criminals or even terrorists. And I would say that there we are still not far enough in this debate because there's quite a lot of misconceptions on this debate which we are having everywhere at the moment. The first misconception is that there is too less information available because I think that we are at a point of history of human beings where there is more information available on the life of every human being than ever before. So never before we have had so much information being tracked or processed on certain activities of persons, even of individuals, their lives, their all-day behavior. All of that is has potentially raised and grown throughout the last years. So it's just really not true that there's too less information around. What is true, of course, is that criminals or those who try to evade effective law enforcement try to hide and to perhaps even delete these informations as far as possible, or to try to not make it available for anyone else. But that leads me to the second misconception, which is that I think there's not such a thing as no traces in a digitized world of today. So even if you try to get around the fact that so much information is digitized and processed, you will always leave traces at certain moments. So if you try to evade, for example, targeted surveillance measures by encrypting your communication, there will still be far more information available, for example, on metadata, on certain connections to certain persons, on location information, which may be still available for those who need to know something. So there's always a starting point. For example, if you think from the view of an investigator that there's a certain person which may be connected to me, there's always a starting point to then try to get into the lives and the activities of those persons. So I think that there is also a misconception about the fact that today it is far more easy to get rid of the information which you leave, because in former times I think it was very easy to evade by just going off the street, perhaps to deal with certain criminal activities and go to the woods or to some areas, rural areas, where there's no person at all tracking you. So it's similar today. And if you do these comparisons between the former completely analog environment and today's digitized technologies, I think that we need to also get back the values which we have built on these realities until now. For example, that we had decisions on the balancing of different public interests and also of the fundamental rights of different persons, and apply that to the new environments. And that is, for example, that nobody would ever in democracy have decided to put a police person at every corner of every street and write down who's coming by, the name, and perhaps a description of the person or how this person is going, and write it down for each and every movement the whole day, everywhere. Nobody would ever have that idea in the analog world, but in the digital world we're doing that with data retention, at least with so-called blanket data retention. So because this is without any indication of a certain risk or suspicion. So in the analog world, we would have decided to say, okay, an investigator first needs to check where the risk is coming from, and then can go there and track the people at a certain place or at a certain event. And then it's also a proportionate, it might be also a proportionate infringement of their fundamental rights. But this debate we haven't done so far. So another example, coming back to the encryption part, is that in our normal analog environment, nobody would have called for the constructors of houses or of doors or locks to provide a certain key to the state authorities to each and every house, door or key they are producing or building and selling to the market, because everybody would have said that's completely insane. That's not only unproportionate with regard to the burden on the producer, it's also unproportionate with regard to the possible intrusion of the private life of those person living behind that door, behind that lock, or in that building. But that's exactly what some parts in political leadership are proposing, to just order every producer of certain technology to supply the possibility for backdoors or keys into certain security techniques. And so what we would have done in the past is that we would have said, okay, if there is a certain risk or a certain suspicion, or you have really the right to get into a building, then you have to build the means to get in there. And that is something, of course, where in today's time, I think public authorities are still, or also law enforcement authorities, are still not equipped for. And there we need to talk about a better equipment and also better training in this area, which is not only for law enforcement authorities, but of course for many others too. And there I come to another field where I see this evolving, and that is the responsibility for secure and for a secure environment, also of course for those producers, because I think they have responsibilities, in particular when it comes to assuring that certain security standards are in place, and that a secure environment which we build in our world is not undermined. To draw comparisons again with certain analog examples, it was very clear after a certain time that it would not be accepted that people sell cars or bikes without certain safety standards, without certain additional safeguards for also perhaps security, perhaps even respect to certain traffic rules. So it is clear that I think we need this to be applied also in information systems, and that comes down not only to technical standards, which we need alongside with the state of the art of what is possible in a proportionate way. But that also comes down to the fact that there needs to be liability for these standards and possible infringements of these standards. All of that until today is not regulated in that extent that I think that we can really have a trustful environment which protects not only the individual, not only the possible business which might be taking advantage of a certain information system, but that is protecting also the resilience of the whole society and the overall safety in society. So therefore, I think this second field of debate which we are having has to be put forward very dramatically, and there are some starting points where we started to regulate on this question, and that is on the one side in the general data protection regulation, where it is of course most and for the first instance on the protection of personal data of individuals, which means personal integrity, free and self-determined control of individuals over their personal data, but it is also about a certain minimum standard when it comes to IT security, to safety in information systems. There has been a very important proposal brought forward by the European Parliament, which is now also part of this regulation in Article 32, I think, which is listing up a number of certain safeguards which needs to be looked at whenever an information system is also processing personal data, which today, with I would say almost all information systems will be the case. At least most of the controllers couldn't exclude that this might happen. So they need to construct their systems in a way that they are compatible with these basic safeguards, which is the first start, and which is also in the course of an EU regulation, a market standard which we are setting as a big single market in the world. The second important step which we took at the same time is that in the course of sensitive infrastructure, we regulated for the first time also standards for IT security in the Network Information Security Directive of the European Union, which provides for safeguards when it comes, for example, to airport systems or water supply, energy supply, where not only we set standards for the systems, which is very important, but also we for the first time make sure that security incidents, like also data breaches in the data protection regulation, needs to be mandatorily notified to these authorities. In this case of the NIS directive, the certs of the member states, and that those authorities need to cooperate and share information between each other. I think that in order to safeguard better security and assure a high level of protection and defend society from vulnerabilities, this is a very significant step forward, and we hope that this is implemented as soon as possible by member states. although, of course, this can only be a first step. Also, in the data protection regulation, that's only a baseline protection. What is still needed and what is not yet in place is that there is a real minimum standard on IT security safeguards, which are more particular, regulated besides contractual obligations. And there we have a current debate in the course of the Digital Single Market package, where there is a directive providing for safeguards in contracts for consumers in digital content. And I think that we need to make sure that IT security standards are not only obliged if they are foreseen in a contract, but that they are generally applying in all situations of content, online content being provided. So for apps, for example, and others, even if there's no payment done in the first case, because we have more and more free services and products which then don't comply with these basic standards because they think it's only a gift, and so you can't really request certain standards. I think that needs to be made sure, and there we will have to see how the European Parliament and also the Council will improve this Commission proposal. So there are some starting points, and I think that we should in the future even go beyond that. And one of the examples which I would like to mention is that throughout the whole debate on the Snowden documents at the latest, it was very clear that we have a problem when it comes to ensuring that certain security standards are in place, or to make sure that at least they are not undermined. And there we come to the point that very often for authorities, it is almost impossible to check that, and also for a critical public sphere, for consumers, it's impossible to check that because of very closed source technologies. So I think that at least when it comes to the application of the rule of law of certain public authorities' rules and standards, it needs to be sure that for certain authorities, the source codes are opened up, or in public procurement, it is clear that open source is something which is a precondition for services and products when they are supplied to public authorities, for example. So that's one point where I think that we need to work on. And another one is that I think there are already quite a lot of good examples how to combine, for example, new technologies on, call it big data or Internet of Things services and products, which build on anonymization tools, which build on a reduction of personalized information, a reduction of surveillance effects. And I think that as Europeans, we have quite a lot of good examples where this is very far already. We should strengthen these examples and make also a competitive advantage out of it. And that is something which we try to do by having a strong framework for data protection with the regulation from 2018. That is also where I think that there could be certain better safeguards in IT security, in cybersecurity, to also build some kind of a gold standard and a selling point from a European perspective, because I am very sure that in some certain near future, it will be a competitive advantage to be first on this and to have a very trustful environment and services which build on the safeguard that you are treated anonymously as a general standard, and only if it's really necessary, or if it's your explicit will, then you can do it with personalized information. That is what I wanted to bring across. I think that today's example, or yesterday's example of the Yahoo case, shows once more how important it is that we have this progress in law, And I'm very happy that it shows very clearly how important the changes with the general data protection regulation are, because the data breach notifications provisions, which is then subject to sanctions up to billions of euros, would have hindered that people are not aware that they are exposed to huge risks so long time, but rather brought a stricter overview over these services. And I hope that this is helping in the future to mitigate that risks. Thank you very much, and I'm also still open to perhaps answer the one or two questions if there are.
Thank you, Jan. Let me see now from the audience. Someone may have some questions. Okay, we're close to lunch,
exactly.
so but maybe I'll just put in a small question. So I mean, you've talked about the fact that there's so much data around that that's being collected by private and state agencies, and so they have so much information. So do you think that there is a potential risk for law enforcement to not be able to track certain terrorist states or terrorist groups which may actually go after very dangerous infrastructure or being very well financed? Is that the real risk, or it's not? Because one thing is having the data of all simple people and so on for mass surveillance. Another thing is being able to go after a dangerous, well-funded and sophisticated criminal which may be using sophisticated technologies, and so trying to prevent that. And the second thing, I mean, would be, what do you think of the latest proposal by the German and French Prime Minister, Interior Ministers, which did not propose a backdoor? They proposed that IT providers would be mandated to be able to comply to lawful access requests, which is, and they shift the burden on them on how they figure it out. So it basically means that somehow need to store this sensitive data and somehow safeguard it and give it when asked.
Yeah, that is a clear hint to an extension of the blanket data retention measures also to IT services, to internet services. And I don't think that this is the right way, because as you said clearly, it is about certain suspects and certain criminals which you are chasing. And it seems to be not really helpful to then talk about the information of all the others. So, but what they hint at with this notion is that you should just extend blanket data retention so that you can comply in case we need certain data of you. And I think that this just points at the wrong direction. What I can see is that law enforcement and security authorities in certain case-by-case situations may demand you to comply. And then the question is in how far you can comply as a company. And I think that if it's possible to comply because you have the information, then you need to give it. But if you constructed your services in a way that you can't do what the authorities want, then I don't think that you should be the one who is obliged to change that. But it should be rather the police and law enforcement authorities who should seek for ways to do it on a different way rather than asking you. And I think that there, and that's the answer to the question, are some other ways. For example, you could rely more on covered investigators. People who get into networks of criminals or terrorists, and then, for example, who get into the private communication WhatsApp group of these persons, and most of the terrorists use this. So you are then into the group and get perhaps certain information or certain indications where you can chase it. So what I say is that I don't think that it's impossible for you to get certain information from these criminals. And what I'm convinced of is that even the most technical, advanced, and equipped person will leave traces and will have weak links. And the task is not to, as you say, swift the burden over to private companies to just deliver the wish list of the security authorities, but in contrary, invest in security authorities to be able to solve their problems on their own. Because in the analog environment, we also wouldn't have said that the provider or the people who run, for example, a certain train network or who run a highway or something, that they are the ones who are the key to the success of investigators. They are forced to do what's in their possibility, but I wouldn't say that it would be right to, for example, say, in case we need to know who was going on your highway, you need to comply, which means that you need to track everybody who's going on your highway. So I just think that this is not the right way for the authorities to go there.
Sure. I just wanted to, from my reading and from the statements that were published only in French, of that joint press release, I had Google's translation done, but there was also an official one. Basically, they didn't really. It could be interpreted as asking for a data retention of all the data of the users, but not necessarily so, because they're shifting a burden to comply to lawful access requests. The obligation to retain all data is a different thing. So you could have...
but if you don't have the data, or you don't get it because you programmed your system in a way that you have not the possibility to access these data, then you can't comply with the request because it's not possible for you.
Well, you could have, it would be compatible with the very very generic statements that they made, because they always make very generic statements, and so people don't really understand what they're proposing. It could be compatible with that statement, the request that providers just store keys and temporary keys. For example, the provider could store, if I have an authorization to do lawful interception on a certain user for the next month, and the judge has said so. The provider could have a peer-to-peer architecture, certified with levels that we talked about that are needed, and just store temporary keys, which are only for a week, a day, and so on and so forth, so that if there is a lawful access request for intercepting that person for 1 month without him knowing, there would be some process to evaluate if the lawful request is constitutional and so on, and they could be given just those keys for interception. Of course, the request could be just search and seizure, like looking at all the data, and so the provider would have to store keys that would be stored in a safe way, so that even the provider cannot access it, or people within the provider, and would give those keys would enable the search, kind of like searching in your house, they break down the door, or it would be, it's similar to that. So there could be ways in which are compatible with what they said, the 3 lines that they said there, which would not require necessarily a data retention. Would absolutely require that the provider retains keys, temporary keys, to make sure that abuse would be limited. And maybe one comment I could add is that a provider of systems already has a key to every device, and the key is the firmware upgrade. So every device that you buy, a computer, a phone, the provider usually sends you an update, security updates and so on and so forth. What kind of guarantees do we have that security update is not compromised? What are the standards under which it's done? How do we know that they weren't pressured by security? So that is a backdoor. That was one of the comments they made on the FBI Apple case, that the firmware upgrade is already a backdoor, because we have no clue how it's done. So there is already very sensitive information and capabilities on the provider to completely compromise the user. So I just wanted to clarify that this could be one of the possible things that they mean
I get the point. First of all, starting with the latter one, I would say there is always a huge difference between the relation between the system provider and the consumer, which is a relation, first of all, which the consumer can more easily control together with the help of certain authorities or consumer associations, for example. And of course, I can change the service. If something is obliged by the state, then all the service will be at this level. So if the state obliges a certain measure to undermine, for example, the security, then this counts for all the services, while if the service is doing that only for updates, for example, I can go to another one where I feel more safe because I know that perhaps the updates are open source and I see what's happening and so on. But with regard to the point that there might be less intrusive measures to, for example, comply with security requests, I would say, first of all, if it doesn't make a difference if you do a temporary key or a long-term key. It's a weakness, and it can be compromised in the same way. So if a company decides I make end-to-end encryption, then it means I don't have the key. So if you do a temporary key or a long-term key to make it available to someone, it's no end-to-end encryption anymore. It's just encryption with key for certain cases. And that, of course, I think is exactly the point where I see why is that necessary? Because as you mentioned, the door issue is different to that. You will have to break the door because you don't have a key. You don't get even a temporary key. So the question is, shouldn't it be the same here? And also the effectiveness of that measure. How high is the effectiveness? Because if I use a communication app and there's encryption in, and I know that there is a temporary key which may be made available for the security services, then I use another encryption layer and put it on my communication before using that service. So for somebody who really wants to get out of surveillance, or I use a secret language to say it with some children's example, you know. So the question is, where does that end? That we oblige certain services? Does that mean then that we forbid encryption technologies, because that would be the outcome of that, and to forbid end-to-end encryption, because otherwise you won't get the obligation to have the temporary key. So I think that rather than chasing after the more and more sophisticated possibilities to evade a certain surveillance, we should concentrate on finding those information which are available at the current situation. So not to make a general rule that I can access this or that service and that the companies need to help me, but to have good investigators who are just searching for that information which they can find. And I'm very sure that in each and every case there can be found information. But it was also in the past always the case that there are cases, yes, where we don't get enough information. And that is how the world is. Because if we would say all information should be available every time, then this I don't think would be applicable to a free society.
Okay, I just want to thank Jan Albrecht for this great speech and also this interaction. And I hope next year you can participate to our Challenge B, which was actually focusing very much to this issues between privacy and safety, and maybe and hopefully next year we'll have someone from the security side, from Europol, all the agencies of public security, police. We've invited all of them. We invited them last year. We invited them in New York. We invited them this year, and all of them declined. So I should say that on the privacy side, there is a willingness to confront on these issues. On the other side, they have statements of 3 lines. Oh, we can do it, and we'll tell you in a while, and they never come with decent proposals. Then the United States, sometimes they have some legislative proposals which are completely, scary and meaningless. And so I really hope that we can convince, maybe jointly next year, a real debate, because I haven't seen any debate whatsoever on the two sides confronting these issues. So
I would be very happy to do so and to come back and also to help finding those people. I just would like to highlight that not only in the US but also in Europe there are those scary debates going on, and perhaps it is possible to invite people from the Council of Europe who are working on the Cybercrime Convention review, because I think that would be a very interesting debate.
Okay, thanks again, Jan, and lunch is ready. Thank you.
Lunch is gone already.
Go on.
Okay, yeah, fine, thanks. Exactly.